Once again, thank you so much for joining us this evening. I am extremely happy to welcome back author Matthew Cost. He took some time with us last year to talk about his first book, which was I Am Cuba, Fidel Castro and the Cuban Revolution. And I must say, today feels like we might be sitting in Cuba talking about that book again. But no, we are here in balmy Maine to talk about two of his new books, which are actually set in Maine. So I'm excited to hear about these books. Let me tell you a little bit about Matt Cost, if you're not familiar with him. Over the years, Matt Cost has owned a video store, a mystery bookstore, and a gym. He has also taught history and coached just about every sport imaginable. And since the age of 8, his true passion has been writing. So as I mentioned, that I Am Cuba, Fidel Castro and the Cuban Revolution was his first traditionally published novel. And we are so glad that he is back to tell us about all of the upcoming novels he has, as well as these two special ones we're going to discuss tonight. I also wanted to point out that this is really cool because Matt was chosen to have his book, Mainely Power, as the Maine Humanities Council Read Me statewide summer book read. So it's a big deal and we're lucky to have him. All right, so enough of me. I'm going to turn the program over to Matt Cost. Welcome.
Well, thanks for everybody for attending, and it's good to see your faces. It would be nice when we can do this in person and I can come visit Camden. That'd sure be a bonus, but this will suffice for now. Feel free to ask questions as we proceed, either through the chat box or raising your hand, or however Julia wants to handle it. I'm very happy to interact, because one of the things about my book, Mainly Power, being selected by the Maine Humanities Council Read Me Book of the Year, is to create discussion around reading. And so I'd rather not just blab on about it. I would rather answer questions that might interest you particularly. So feel free to raise your hand and interact with this as we go. Julia mentioned my book, I Am Cuba, Fidel Castro and the Cuban Revolution. And interestingly enough, the path to publication for Mainly Power really started with that 30 years ago, when I wrote a rough draft of I Am Cuba and realized at that point 3 things. 1, that my writing needed to improve a lot. 2, that I needed to do more research. And 3, that I really needed to visit Cuba to have a more authentic understanding of the country and be more sincere in my writing. So I kind of put that aside, and life got in the way, and I opened some businesses, as Julia talked about. And sometime towards the late 90s, early 2000s, I decided to try my hand at a couple mysteries. And that's when I wrote the first draft of Mainly Power. And I peddled that around a little bit, didn't have any luck, and wrote another one, Mainly Fear, the sequel to it, and peddled that around and didn't have much luck. And I was kind of okay with that because I was still treating them as a kind of a learning curve, a way to improve my writing. And I realized that I had steps still to go. So then I'd left business and I went into teaching, and somewhere along the lines there, I took a course on teaching biography in the classroom. And I said, hey, maybe I should get back to writing a historical again. Let's try a new one, because I still haven't had a chance to visit Cuba. So I decided to write about something a little closer to home, Joshua Chamberlain and the Civil War, which is in my hometown of Brunswick. I'm down here in Brunswick, and this is where he lived. And the Bowdoin College has a lot of resources for that. So I researched that for 5 or 6 years, actually, while I was teaching school, and thought, hey, this one's pretty good. I can really make something happen. And again, fell a little bit short, didn't quite get the interest, but I decided to self-publish this one. And so I went through Amazon and CreateSpace, and I published Joshua Chamberlain and the Civil War in 2015. And soon after, I got my chance to visit Cuba. So in 2016, I took a 2-week trip to Cuba along with my son, Pearson, and we had a self-devised Revolutionary War trail that we followed, following Fidel Castro and his band of bearded guerrillas around during the revolution from 1953 to 1959. And so throughout all this, I'd continued researching, I'd continued writing, and now I'd finally visited Cuba. So I thought it was probably time to redo that book and see what I could get with it. And I did that. I found a publisher for it and published it last March, which was quite exciting. And along the lines, after they had agreed, you know, it usually takes about a year from accepting it for publication to actually publication date. I approached him and I said, you know, I've got these other two mysteries kicking around that if I were to pretty heavily edit them and bring them back to you, do you think that you'd consider taking a look at them? And they said, sure, great. And so Mainly Power was finally published some 20 years later, last September, after some very heavy edits. And, you know, it's sort of the 30-year learning curve that I had of learning to write. You know, I never took a Master's of Fine Arts program, or I wasn't an English major, I was a history major, and this and that. And so it was very exciting to me when it was recommended by Jerry Boyle and the Maine Humanities Council selected it as the Read Me Fiction Book of the Year. And so that's kind of one of the reasons why I'm talking to you today, to begin that discussion around that book. I think I'll read a little excerpt from it right now just to give you a little flavor. And I'm not going to start right at the beginning. There's kind of a nice hook at the beginning, but this will start giving you a little more flavor of my protagonist, Goff Langdon, and his love interest, Shabal Daniels. So it introduces the characters a little better. So I'm on page 10. Prior to this, you know, not a whole lot has happened other than head of a security at Down East Power, a nuclear power plant in Maine, has been killed. And it's suspicious circumstances, but it's ruled a suicide. So at this point, Langdon is just arriving to work. A few minutes before 9 o'clock, Langdon, freshly showered in a crisp, dry, clean shirt, arrived at his bookstore. It was actually much a more loved hobby than a hugely profitable business, though it did pay most of the bills and keep Coffee Dog in quality kibble. Thanks to his crazy Aunt Zelda, who had a special affinity for her nephew, Goff, and had left him a legacy to match, Langdon was able to supplement his unreliable private investigation business with a mystery bookstore that had no outstanding loans. This was a godsend, as the book business was pretty much suicide. Langdon had quickly discovered that the margins of an independent shop were razor thin, no match for the mega stores and the new thing called Amazon. But with no debt and a small payroll, Langdon found he could get by. The population of a small Maine town like Brunswick, about 25,000, couldn't wholly support a venture of such limited and specific interests as that of a mystery bookstore. Yet by the very same short-sighted logic, his day job as a private eye in rural Maine should have curled up and died before it was born. Langdon had always gone his own way in life, and he held to the philosophy that if you liked your work, then you didn't need much else. It seemed to be the trend of the present generation to slave 40 to 60-hour a week at jobs they didn't like just to make enough money to take a yearly 2-week vacation in the Virgin Islands, or to buy a jet ski to ride on Sunday afternoon for 2 months of the year, or to drive a Volvo, living the American capitalist dream. This was not a mentality that Langdon understood. His father had once told him, Goff, do whatever you want in life, but make sure that you do it correctly. If you're going to be a ditch digger, well then be the best darn ditch digger there is. This is how Langdon had lived his life thus far. Once he dug his teeth into something, he didn't let go until it was done. The glass door he now pushed open had 2 inscriptions. the top of the door reading The Coffee Dog Bookstore, and the bottom, Goff Langdon, Private Detective. The store sat right on Main Street, the only truly Main Street in the state. Brunswick as a town was very much a throwback to the way things used to be in rural America, with small local stores owned and operated by people who lived in town. Main Street was the widest Main Street in the state with 2 lanes going each way. Brick sidewalks stretched luxuriously in front of numerous and varied businesses, a natural food store, 2 bakeries, a coffee shop house, a video store, a restaurant or 2, and here and there a doctor or dentist's office. All of the owners local fixtures in the neighborhood who not only greeted customers by name, but asked after their spouses and kids too. The Coffee Dog Bookstore sat right in the center of all this. It had expansive picture windows displaying a sampling of what lay inside, the most extensive collection of mystery books in all of Maine. These books had shaped Langdon's life, starting with Encyclopedia Brown, The Hardy Boys, and The Great Brain, before progressing with time into James Lee Burke, Dashiell Hammett, Raymond Chandler, James Crumley, Stephen Greenleaf, and John Dunning, amongst others. He was not always sure that the deep impact these books had had upon his life had been a good thing. After all, it was more than likely the reason for his wife leaving him. Langdon banished this from his mind and set himself the task of opening the store, turning on the lights, making coffee, booting up the computer, stocking the cash register, and picking some good jazz for the morning sound, choosing Louis Armstrong to start the day. At 9:30 a.m. on the button, 2 things happened. Langdon flipped the opened sign up and opened the door for Chabelle. She was his sole employee, a mother of 3, though only 31. She still had the figure of a college co-ed. Wisp of blonde hair poked out from under her navy blue beret, framing the delicate composition that was her face, the green fire of her eyes, and the spray of freckles that stood out in the morning's chill. Her cheeks bulged slightly like a squirrel with a nut on each side, a trait that Langdon had come to find adorable. She was 2 inches over 5 feet, about eye level with Langdon's upper rib cage. Pert is the word that came to mind when describing her, but he knew better than to voice it. Just when the bookshop had become busy enough for Langdon to hire his first employee, Chabelle had walked through the door as if sent by some divine fate. A conversation about a book had evolved into him asking if she wanted a job, and she shrugged and said sure. When he asked about her exotic name, pronounced Chabelle, she told him that her mother had grown up in the town of Chautauqua in upstate New York. The next town over was the childhood home of Lucille Ball, and so she'd closely followed the career of that star, and in many ways closely identified with the TV series I Love Lucy. When her only daughter was born, she morphed her hometown with her hero, and it came up with Chabelle. He knew that Chabelle had been up since 5 to get her kids ready for school, just like he knew she came by her teeming energy without the benefits of coffee. In fact, he reflected he knew quite a lot about her, though less about her home life, as she was a private person. So that's kind of an introduction to my characters, Langdon and Chabelle. Interestingly enough, the Coffee Dog bookstore that he is opening up this morning is the only true place in the book. The rest is fiction, but that was a bookstore that I owned some 25 years ago, was the Coffee Dog bookstore, mystery bookstore here in Brunswick. So that's where the idea generated, was from that mystery bookstore that I owned. I'd certainly like to take any questions if anybody has any on what I've talked about and read so far, but if not, I can continue on.
Sure. So let's, for a couple of you who've joined us a little bit later, you are welcome to, we're going to be asking questions aloud or typing them into the chat box, whichever you feel most comfortable about. If you'd like to ask a question, you can, I'm going to go ahead and say, allow participants to unmute themselves. So you should be able to unmute yourself and you can just kind of raise your hand. I'll get it started. So Matt, I was curious, how you decided to start setting your books in Maine. I wanted to know if the experience you had with writing I Am Cuba left you feeling, frustrated because you were so distant from the actual physical setting of that place and the culture, or was it something else that made you decide upon Maine as a setting?
No, it was absolutely that. As I said, early on, I realized that I needed to work on my writing quite a bit. I needed to do more research, but equally important was the authenticity of knowing the place that you're writing about. And without a visit to Cuba, I, didn't feel like I would bring any sort of sincerity over it in my writing. So that kind of put me on the back burner for uh, 26 years, I guess, with a book on a dusty shelf. So that learned. In the meantime, I did do the Joshua Chamberlain book and the Mainly Power and Mainly Fear, all with more of a basis generated out of Brunswick, my hometown. A little bit later, I'll probably talk about how that also creates some difficulties writing about your hometown and what you're so closely associated with. And one of the reasons why book two we'll talk about tonight, Wolfe Trap, is a fictional Maine town so that
Hmm.
I can get away from some of those nuances.
So I heard you on the radio a couple weeks ago. You were on Maine Calling, I believe it was, and I think you had mentioned a particular convention that you attended or writing workshop that you had attended that was really important to help you make that decision to transition from historical fiction to mystery writing. Do you want to talk a little bit about that inspiring moment?
Well, there were really two, with the smaller one here in Maine, in Portland, I attended Crime Bake, which I realized that these were my people and it was a much smaller setting, but I really got along with everybody from, you know, the most famous of the writers there to the least famous. And nobody put on any airs and everybody was just supportive of each other. And won't point any specific fingers, but I hadn't always run into that in my historical uh, conferences. I felt like a little bit of an odd duck out in many ways. And I think part of the reasoning is I was sort of an odd duck because so much of what sells for historical fiction these days is Victorian romance,
Of
you know,
course.
time periods. So it's, you set it in Victorian times and call it a historical novel, but really it's just a romance. And so, my book's about Fidel Castro and Joshua Chamberlain, and my new one coming up, based in New Orleans after the Civil War and the battle for social and political equality, are a little bit rougher than around the edges than the romances that I was uh, walking around. So, and then I went to Thriller Fest in New York City, which was just the same, but on a much larger scale with just so many more writers. And, I'd find myself talking to these award-winning authors and not even knowing that, who they were, just kind of chatting and this and that. And, people would be coming up and, one of them was Lori Radar Day. Oh no, that was at Crime Bake, but Lori Radar Day, and people kept coming up and congratulating her on winning an Agatha and this and that. And I'm like, who is this person? And
Ah.
I figured it out after the fact. But it's just a very comfortable crowd in the mystery field for sure. That in Maine, but at a larger setting as well.
Well, I also want to point out that, sometimes it is hard to know who you're talking to because all you writers use different names for different types of books that you write. So, for those of you who don't know, Matt Cost is also Matthew Langdon Cost, and that's the name he goes by with his historical fiction writing. But anyhow, so again, it looks like we don't have any questions in the chat box right now, and no one's raising their hand. So, why don't we just go ahead and move on to talking about Wolfe Trap, and then we can go back to having some Q&A at the end of the program.
Okay, fantastic. And there's also problems that come along with having two different author names, Matt Cost and Matthew Langdon Cost. It's, you get yourself onto many different sites for reviewing and this and that, and they don't all allow you to be both.
Mm.
So you have to be two people, and that's a little annoying. But it was thought by my publisher that it would be fun to separate my mysteries from my histories by
Sure.
the slight name change. So that's kind of neat as well. So yeah, you know, Mainly Power was just published in September, and Mainly Fear followed in December. And in the meantime, because all this publication stuff takes a long time, and because I'm now dedicated to writing and I'm not, my kids have, grown up and moved out, and I'm not no longer teaching school, which I did for a while, or running businesses, I write a lot. So Mainly Money came out in March, and at the point of finishing Mainly Money, I started to realize that there are some problems with writing about a real place and fictionalizing it. And a lot of the main character has pieces of me in it, even though it's not me. As a matter of fact, I went so far as to perhaps make the mistake of calling him Goff Langdon, and Langdon is my middle name. So things like that, it just became a little problematic. There are other people in town that would, asked if this was them or that was them. And I, use real places and change the names of them. And I had fun doing that. But all of that just, skirts a little too close to nonfiction sometimes. And so I decided to, come up with a new series, and this time create a town. And this was sort of exciting because, I've made this huge map that's on my wall. And every time I add a place to my fictional town of Port Essex, I have to pencil in that place on the map, because I'm currently writing the fourth book in that series. And to keep it all straight, it's kind of necessary to have a map and where the places are and what they're called, and little notes about them, as well as keeping an outline for all of that. So I decided to create this new detective series where Clay Wolfe is not nearly so much like me. He might have a little bit of my biting sarcasm and things like that, but I, made sure to separate him from me. He's very well dressed, which nobody has ever claimed I'm well dressed. So, things like that. And create this fictional town around this fictional person who is most certainly not me. And the basis for the Clay Wolfe book was a really terrible event that happened here in Maine. A little blip, maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago in the news that I came across, is that there was this mother who was wiping the residue from her heroin baggie on her baby's gums to stop it from teething. And over the course of a few weeks of doing this, the baby died. And that's really the basis for my book, that then springs forward into this entire heroin problem that we're having, and opioid crisis that we're having, and kind of digging into all of that. And it, I guess it's not, a rosy story by any stretch, but it certainly is less grim than the start, when the baby dies from, and the grandmother comes in to hire our protagonist, Clay Wolfe, to find out not, who was responsible for the death of her grandbaby, because she knows that her daughter was responsible, but who was responsible for selling the drugs to her daughter that she then used to wipe the gums of the infant with. So that's kind of, again, the hook of my book that I start off with, is this lady, Crystal Landry, comes in to hire Clay Wolfe for this purpose of tracking down who is bringing drugs through Port Essex, and who's responsible for it. But I'm not going to start my reading it right at that point. I'm going to take my reading to a little bit further in. So once again, I can introduce a little bit better Clay Wolfe and his partner, Bailey Baker. Clay crystal out and down the stairs. His office was on the second floor of a building that had been a boating supply store, but now housed a gift shop gallery. They had no use for the second floor, and thus it had remained empty for about a year until Clay had returned to town looking for just such a location. Actually, he'd been looking for a dingy, windowless place like Sam Spade's Digs. But when he saw the view, kudos to Spade, but modern times meant better views or something like that. As he came back up the stairs, he took a second to admire the inscription on the door, Clay Wolfe, private detective. Sounds vaguely reminiscent of my last when Golf Langdon's looking at his inscription too, right? Pushing open the door, Clay was met with the bouncing tune of Along Came Betty, played by Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers. Benny Golson, who composed the piece, was gambling along on the tenor sax like a 5 o'clock shadow. Bailey Baker, his receptionist, was at her desk pretending to be busy while in reality just waiting to hear the dirt on the new client. He liked that she was a jazz fan. Clay pretended to head straight back into his office, but was met with a not so fast mister look. She was 7 inches over 5 feet and had dark brown eyes that matched her hair. Got something for me? Clay asked. You're going to tell me about the new client? Bailey's smile never quite filled itself out and disappeared quicker than it arrived. She doesn't look like your normal customer. Remember that lady who killed her baby by rubbing heroin on the little girl's gums? Sure, she said. Kelly Ann Landry. That was the grandmother of the baby, Kelly Ann's mother. Young for a grandmother. From 30 feet away, she looks like a lot of class. From 10 feet away, she looks like something made up to be sane from 30 feet away. Clay growled in his best Philip Marlowe impression. He couldn't remember which of Hammett's books the line was from, but it was so good he'd remembered it. I could have guessed she was all of 40. Kelly Ann Landry is her third child. Don't let her diminutive figure fool you. You get close, her face tells another tale. Let me guess, her precious daughter didn't do it at all. She's taking the fall for the baby daddy. Not at all, Clay said. He was well aware of Bailey's sensitivity to domestic abuse. After all, she had been one such victim, having shot and killed her abuser and husband just a year earlier. She seems to accept that her daughter did what she did. What she wants to know is, who was supplying Kelly Ann with the heroin? Yeah, drug abuse certainly seems to be all over the news these days, but who would have thought of Port Essex? Bailey looked away. Pretty scary stuff. I sure saw some things in Boston I don't care to ever see again, Clay said. Worse than a mother rubbing heroin laced with fentanyl on the gums of her baby girl? No, he admitted, that's rock bottom. Why do you think it's become such a problem? I guess it has to do with all the doctors pushing opioids over the past years. What was the big one in the news a few months back? Purdue Pharma? Bailey's hair was pulled back in a bun. She wore a white sweater over her blouse, as Clay liked to keep the office cool in the winter and downright cold in the summer. The Sackler family made billions off OxyContin. That is, until they went bankrupt in the face of thousands of lawsuits. Bankrupt? Clay raised an eyebrow. You mean another way for the 1% to protect their money? They got so much hidden offshore accounts that those islands are sinking with the weight of it. Those are the ones that you should go after, Clay Wolfe. She gave that fluttering half smile. He muttered something that might have been a curse under his breath. The Sackler family will be living like kings in some paradise long after hell freezes over. Which isn't looking good, real good now, is it? Not with global warming and all that. Clay contemplated the concept that hell would not be freezing over anytime soon, at least not with the current administration's backtracking of environmental concerns. It was bound to stay hot for the immediate future. Look, I'm going to jump right on this case, he said after a moment. Do you have anything pressing on the agenda? You're supposed to be in Woolwich today watching Gary Stout. He took medical leave from BIW for his back and is pressing for workman's comp. They're not so sure it's on the up and up. Bailey scrolled down the screen. Also, you're supposed to get started checking up on Allison Daigle's husband to see if he is working late nights or boffing his secretary. That's about it until next week. Can you see if Don wants to pick up a few extra bucks? If he's available, have him go down and keep an eye on Stout's back. Remind him to bring his camera. Clay used Don occasionally to do surveillance and stakeouts when he had other cases vying for his attention. He does tend to forget that the telescopic lens provides better visuals for the customers than his cell phone, Bailey said. I should be able to swing by Alan Daigle's office later and check up on him. Where do you plan on starting your investigation, Mr. Wolfe? Where else? At the bar, of course. So Port Essex is a coastal town somewhere between Brunswick and Camden along the coast. And Clay is going to discover that it's got a large influx of heroin being smuggled through lobster traps through town. And as he digs further and further into the case, it gets more and more complicated and bigger. And he's forced to face some of his cynicism that he's developed as a former Boston homicide detective. And that and the relationship with Bailey are kind of the swirling themes that surround this case of trying to dig out heroin. So is there anything anybody would like to ask about my books, my writing, my
So
process?
yeah, again, I've allowed people, I'm just double checking my setting. You can feel free to unmute yourself and just jump in if you do have a question, or you can type into the chat box if you'd like to go in that way. I know a couple of you mentioned to me when you were requesting your Zoom link tonight that you did have some questions for Matt. So I hope you speak up. And while we wait to see if anyone has anything to say, Matt, I wanted to ask, okay, so the PI thing. Did you miss your calling? Because that's it seems like you have a fondness for the private investigators. So can you speak a little bit about that? Why did you decide to go that direction?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I haven't been asked that before.
Are you a Big Magnum Pi fan?
I did watch a lot of Magnum Pi. And it probably has to do, in the Gough Langdon, the mystery bookstore is, that is indeed how I cut my teeth on Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew and, the Great Brain and the Bobbsey twins and all of those, and kind of developed up through. So I think I fell in love with that mystery genre from an early age. And I'm not quite sure how I got started, if they were just the most accessible, but, certainly with the Hardy Boys, there seemed to be a new one every 2 weeks or something like that, so they could keep you busy. And so I've always liked that genre growing up and reading through it. And, I'm stuck a little bit between, having a love for history as well and a love for mysteries. I think that I'm not quite qualified to write a real homicide detective, Bosch sort of thing. Here in Maine, Bruce Robert Kaufman sort of has, the floor with his Detective Byron series, because he spent 26 years in the police force and he's going to be a little more knowledgeable than me on that.
Mm-hmm.
So I have to go to the small town. Port Essex is approximately the same size as Brunswick, and the mystery bookstore is something that I knew, and the town is something I knew. And Port Essex, even though fictional, is not that different from Brunswick, although it is more coastal and has that influx of summer money and wealth that comes into it that creates a lot of tension between the local fishermen and the out-of-state wealth that arrives sometimes. Um, so I guess those tensions are things that I enjoy.
Did the particular subject matter at any point? I mean, it sounds extremely heavy. Do you have to take a break after writing that for a while? I mean, and switch gears and start writing about something else?
Um, you know, although the theme is fairly heavy, I have very colorful characters, and I try and infuse a lot of humor into it.
Oh, that's good.
Big influences on me are Carl Hyacin and Elmore Leonard and, Robert Parker. and that sort of humor laced with a serious subject.
Mm.
So, you know, I have not taken any time. I'm
Ah,
writing 3 or 4 books a year right now. So, you know, Wolfe Trap is out now. I have a historical coming out in August, which is, you know, based in New Orleans after the Civil War, and it's the fight for political and social equality. And it's that's a pretty gritty one actually.
mm.
But I would say Wolfe Trap is not so much, even though. And then in October, I have the second one coming out, Mind Trap, which is going to be about a cult that is threatening the town of Port Essex. I guess you could say that's a heavy topic too, but I've never really thought um, of my writing as overly heavy. So I think if you give it a try, you would see that there's a lot of color and humor to it as well.
That's good.
And then the third one, Mousetrap, is due out next April.
Are any of the books going to include the map of the town that you've described that you have on your wall? Out of curiosity.
I have talked about having somebody put that into something that is a little more understandable for, you know, a cartographer, I think they're called, right?
Yes, yes.
My map is pretty rough.
I would love to see it. I think it sounds so cool. When you mentioned that, I'm like, that sounds fun. That must be a great fun part about writing a
It is
fictional.
fun to create it. I have talked with the publisher about maybe having somebody put that into, you know, a little more clean prose.
Well,
Understand.
you know, it looks like just, I'm going to give everyone one more chance. Does anyone have anything that they want to ask Matt? You can raise your hand or you can type it into the chat box. If not, all right, I'm not seeing any hands raised. So Matt, I guess we'll just have to keep our eyes peeled for your Victorian romance novel that will be coming out next.
And your hand wasn't raised, was it? You were just putting it over?
Mine?
Anne.
Oh, Anne.
No, okay.
No, okay, we couldn't tell because there's a big glare right there. Sorry. Okie dokie. Everybody else is good? All
Well,
right.
thank you all for coming tonight, and thank you, Julia, for having me. And
Of course.
right
Oh,
on.
yeah, and we've got some claps going in the little chat box there. So thank you, everyone. And we hope you have a wonderful rest of your evening. Please keep your eyes on our website, librarycamden.org. We have information about all the upcoming events. We're doing a lot, you know, at the amphitheater this summer. So come on, visit us in Camden, get outside, enjoy some concerts and theater and dance performances. We got a lot going on and you're always welcome. So, all right, Matt, best of luck. This is going to be an exciting summer for you promoting these books, I'm sure. And like you said, right on.
Right on. And thank you. I look forward to when I can come to Camden and,
Definitely.
you know, see people live.
Do this in person. Yes. All right. Good night, everyone. Stay cool.